Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to what looks, as you enter, to be the ASCOA rave. I have expected whenever I come into work now to be sort of patted down by some Russian mafia guard at the door. So I apologize for the presentation. We're having our lobby redone, but it does look a little scary when you walk in down the metal grated stairs and in through the basement. So apologize for that. We'll be back in operating order very soon. And also thanks for being here on a beautiful day. I teach at Columbia. This is the sort of day in which I'd have my class move outside, but I think we'd probably lose a lot of the audience if we moved it to Central Park. So we'll stay inside on the first beautiful day of spring, but on a very important topic, which is the Venezuelan elections. But more than the elections, because there's been a lot of speculation about who's up, who's down, not just in the last 30 days, but also for the last 14 years. A lot of pollsters have made a career out of tracking Chavez's popularity and now, of course, Maduro's. What we want to focus on here is actually a discussion of what's going to happen after the elections. We'll talk a little bit about what is in the lead up to the 14th on Sunday, but more importantly, what is the new president? What will he have to confront in terms of economics, in terms of security issues, in terms of human rights, in terms of institutional reconstruction, assuming that president is interested in building institutions, and what this will mean for the future of Venezuela. Our other guest, Catherine, is actually landed at Newark and is on the way from New Jersey, which if anyone has been in New Jersey, I've been once, the traffic is only slightly better than Caracas is, so it may take her a while. So when she comes, she'll slide right in. We have, but our other two panelists, who I like to refer to as the Franciscos, are here. I'll introduce Francisco Monadi. Used to be a professor at IESA, a fine institution in Caracas. He's now a visiting professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Francisco Rodriguez was the chief economist of the National Assembly a while ago in Caracas, then was at the UNDP, and is currently at the Bank of America. So he's gone from government to multilateral to the private sector, and I'm resisting the urge to ask him which of those three is more effective and less corrupt, but we'll deal with that another time. But let me start first with the question to Francisco Rodriguez. Give us a sense of what the new president will have to confront, let's say, as soon as they are inaugurated. I'm assuming that, let's assume it's Maduro, the 15th. What economic conditions, constraints will they have to confront over the next 12 months?
So Venezuela is undergoing a macro adjustment at this moment, and it's a pretty major macro adjustment because there were some pretty major imbalances that were created over the past few years. There have been significant disequilibria accumulating over the past 14 years, but in particular during the past 2 years, from the moment in which, starting in 2010, when the government didn't do well in the parliamentary elections, and Chavez started getting prepared for the 2012 presidential elections, it was a major spending boom. In the 12 months before the elections, spending went up in real terms by 26%. Imports went up also by 24% during election year. So basically everything in Venezuela, every single dimension of the public sector and of public spending grew with a very clear goal. And you were almost able to see this and track this in real time. If you looked at spending approvals and spending authorizations in Venezuela, usually have about a 3-month lag before they actually become spending. Well, you actually saw that 15 months before the elections, spending approvals started picking up. Then 12 months before the elections, actually spending disbursements started picking up. And effectively, this was something that was increasing up until October of last year. When you do that in a country that was already starting from a difficult macro situation, you end up with huge imbalances. The imbalances are so large that we actually don't know how large they are. The Ministry of Finance this year, for the first time since 1999, published fiscal figures without the consolidated data. So now we have only private estimates to go for estimating what the consolidated data are. Our estimates, which are actually not as, I would say, more conservative than those of others, put last year's fiscal deficit at 14.5% of GDP. So this means that you actually have to reallocate resources from the rest of society to the government with 14.5% of GDP, and that's not easy to do. In the case of Venezuela, you can do that through a devaluation, but then it has to be a major devaluation. The devaluation has to have substantial contractionary effects. So what we're going to see is the economy contract. We're going to see prices increase, but you do this also in a system where the price system actually doesn't work in Venezuela because it's so heavily regulated that prices can't really transmit and convey the signals that it's usually used for doing. So since prices don't work, then you just have resource allocation going haywire, and that means that you have huge levels of scarcity and people have goods which are apparently affordable but they can't find anywhere. So effectively you have an economy that's almost entered into a tailspin. And the government has already started doing a major macro adjustment. And I think that any government that comes in, their first year is going to be devoted to concluding this macro adjustment. And basically all of their energies at the beginning are going to be concentrated on continuing the adjustment and on trying to do damage control over the consequences of the adjustment.
Give me a sense of what this means in real terms, in terms of the reallocation of capital. I mean, in terms of social programs, are we talking a significant cut in social programs? And what's the scale of the devaluation that you think would be necessary to sort of to recalibrate this distortion? So
the devaluation that's necessary to, say, to recalibrate, but at least to get through the year, is actually sort of what they've done. It's about 40%. I had put it at 43% at the beginning of the year. It's if you look at the two devaluations that the government has done, both taking the Khedive rate to 6.3 and the new CCAT auction system, it's actually equivalent to about 41% devaluation. Now, that effectively means that that the value of the currency that's in people's hands is declining by 41%, and that means that on impact, their wealth, their income, the real income is falling by 41%. Of course, then on top of that, you have inflation. There will be some price adjustments, so it's not, so that's not the complete reallocation of resources, but it is something that's very significant. And
have they felt the bite of that yet? I mean, we had 32% of the 200 million mini devaluation. I mean, but there wasn't much a reaction. Is there more to be felt?
Well, no. Yes, I do think that people have felt the bite, but remember that the Venezuelan government has not allowed prices to adjust. So basically, just about all products, and certainly all regulated products, are at the same price that they were before the devaluation. Even those products that are not regulated, a lot of firms don't want to increase the prices because they feel if the government sees me increase prices by 40, 50%, then they're going to impose a price control on me. So they actually prefer not to sell the goods for the meantime, at least until they get some authorization from the government to go ahead and do it. So it's a bit of a different dynamics because when prices go up and you can't find them in the stores, then you know. When prices can go up and you find things in the store and they're more expensive, you know I can't afford them, and you identify that clearly with what the government did. But if you think that you can afford something but you can't find it in the store today, you say, well, yeah, maybe it wasn't today because it just didn't arrive today. Or there are problems and we don't have this, we have that. So it takes several days, it takes weeks and months for people to understand that they're actually before a generalized phenomena. So with this type of system, it takes longer to sink in, but in the end it ends up being a lot more destructive.
Okay. Since you're both named, I'm going to refer to you as if you're on a football team. So Monaldi, let's take the revenue side. What's there in terms of, I mean, can they generate enough revenue to cover this shortfall? And particularly in the oil sector, what's left in terms of being able to squeeze more oil out of what they can do?
Yes, I wanted just to comment something on what Francisco said. I mean, I think it's really important to understand that when there was a previous adjustment between 2009 and 2010, and we had a recession until the first semester of 2011, the government lost a significant share of popularity, and that allowed the opposition to almost, to actually either tie or, if you want to win the popular vote on the legislative elections. And all this sort of a spending boom that Francisco told us about in late 2011 and 2012 allowed them to win the election by a smaller margin than almost all of the other incumbents in Latin America, but still by a significant margin. So after the elections, they started the adjustment, and the perception of the kind of the economy started thinking in. I think that's very important to notice. They were losing a lot of approval. Both President Chavez and Maduro as vice president their numbers were going down fast until the death of President Chavez, and then numbers skyrocketed back up. And so we now are sort of in a different this is where economists put a dummy variable, where this is different from everything else, right? And so, but then this will sink back in, right? And so I expect President Maduro, if he's the president, to lose a significant amount of popularity and to first go back to what he had just before Chavez with what in the 40s and maybe even lower, maybe go to the 30s. So that will be a big problem. So getting back to the sort of the oil issue, I mean, oil production is not, I think, is not going to change significantly this year. They had this expectation of an increase in production last year that did not materialize, most of it, because even though the Orinoco Belt production is going up slightly, the traditional oil fields of Venezuela are declining. And so the production in the Maracaibo Lake is going down. And even recently, we are seeing something that might become a really problematic trend, which is a decline in the most productive fields of the eastern part of Venezuela, which are the most profitable fields in the country, the ones that have averted sort of the problems that we had in the western, in the Maracaibo Lake area. So I think the government is really worried about this trend, and they are really pushing, trying to become more pragmatic on the Orinoco Belt side. But still things are not materializing by any means, just marginally. The production is increasing in the Orinoco Belt, but as I said, not enough to offset the decline. So, but still, on average, you will not see a significant change either one way or the other. I mean, they seem to be offsetting the two effects each other. So, so still, I mean, at the current prices, even though the government, I mean, the thing is that they weren't crazy last year and they spent, 50% of GDP and with a dramatic overvaluation of the exchange rate. And so that's why in the middle of the largest oil boom in Venezuela's history, you had a deficit of 15 points of GDP, which is really crazy, unbelievable. So they had to adjust back, but still, I mean, the price of oil is really high. The level of production is relatively high. The problem is that they have a lot of leakages. They have, the leakage of the exports, subsidized exports to Cuba and other countries. That's a major issue. Then I think they might have some room to cut back on that, but who knows in terms of the politics. And then they have the domestic leakage. The domestic market is it's crazy. They are, by the way, importing 200,000 barrels of oil of products at 110 and selling them at 0. So for each barrel they lose of those 200,000, they lose more than $100. So that's really amazing. That's not only opportunity cost this time. It's actual cost in terms of expenditures. So that's a problem. And then they have, of course, the issue of repaying the loans to the Chinese. So all those things getting together are more than the production itself, are what made PDVSA had a lot of problems with their cash flow. And that's why recently we saw some signs of pragmatism. Of course, the devaluation, then the decrease in the windfall tax that allows PDVSA to have a little bit better cash flow. And now this additional sort of devaluation, by the way, that is not going back to PDVSA, the money is not going back to PDVSA, but that gives the government some sort of room to maneuver.
At what point does, let's assume, it's not a huge assumption here, that Maduro wins. At what point does the government start to feel the spite? At what point does the government, you're talking about a sort of the pragmatic calculation. At what point does that sort of enter in when they realize their back's against the wall and they have to start to do this stuff?
Well, I think you're seeing it already. The fact that the government hasn't done this huge devaluation and done it before the elections. Actually, there are two devaluations. One of them was 2 weeks before the election, except for the fact that it's been that it actually had its back to the wall. It really couldn't do anything else. And so I think that as a result of that, we are seeing, and we're going to start seeing a lot more pragmatism in terms of macroeconomic policy, because since the government has to adjust, since it has this huge budget gap, since it has, if you take out a very short period, which was the period of the Lehman crisis, when the price of oil went from $120 to $40 a barrel. Venezuela now has its first current account deficit since 2001. In 2001, the price of oil was $16 a barrel. Now it's $100 a barrel. It's the situation, the way that it was going, it was completely unsustainable. The government had essentially depleted all of the money that it had in the off-budget funds, which were the main additional source of revenue that it had to fund all of these large projects. So it's gone into adjustment mode. Now, does that provoke a different set of policies than just macro adjustment? Not necessarily. I mean, I think you have exchange rate adjustment, you have lower spending, and you have inflation, which is going to reduce the value of the domestic public debt, and it's also going to reduce real wages. And then with those measures, you can restore fiscal equilibrium until the government feels that it needs to start spending again in the dimension in which it was spending back in 2012. But up until that moment, you have macro equilibrium, which can be restored in Venezuela with a devaluation. And here's why Venezuela is actually quite different from many other countries. Given that in Venezuela, more than 60% of the revenues of the consolidated public sector actually come from oil, and that the state is the country's only oil exporter, that means that the government has one relative price that it can change by decree. They can effectively move resources from the rest of society to itself. And it doesn't even have to get this approved by law, to have a political discussion, because there's no system capable of political debate, and because even if there were, this has been traditionally a decision that's in the hands of the Venezuelan government. So it's like if in the US, Obama or whoever's president was able to just sign a decree and say, well, yeah, I'm going to raise taxes without having to get this by Congress, I'm going to apply my solution, then it would be a lot easier to do it. That's what allows Venezuela to adjust so easily. Now, easily means it's easy for the government to implement it. It doesn't face active political resistance at the moment of implementing it. Easy doesn't mean that it's easy from the standpoint of the consequences. So that's where I do think that we're going into a scenario where, given that they had to do it, and given that it was the only way in which they could address it, now we're going to have a period of Maduro having very low popularity. With an added problem, which is that I think that if Chavez had done this and people had gone through the same crisis, then they would have been saying, well, you know, there are a lot of things that Chavez did for us that we think are valuable about the last 15 years under Chavez. And yes, I mean, the last year has been very bad, but the previous 14 years were good. That's obviously what Venezuelans thought when they re-elected Chavez. But with Maduro, this year is going to be his complete record. The other 14 years are Chavez, and this is going to be what's going to distinguish Maduro from Chavez. Now, can Maduro stay in power in that context? I actually think the answer is yes. I think that he can. I don't necessarily think that he will. I'm not saying that I'm predicting that he will, but I think that he can. And I think that he can because Chavez left in place a structure of power that was completely centralized in the presidency. You have a very powerful presidency. Political scientists make these evaluations of presidentialism. The two most presidentialist systems in Latin America, the two most presidentialist constitutions, are those of Venezuela and of Cuba. Given this, and this is centralization of power at the level of the state and centralization of power at the level of the party. In a country where the only source of external revenue is owned by the government, this effectively means that it's very easy for whoever's in the government to be able to buy the loyalties of politicians. And what Chavez was able to do didn't have to do only with his charisma, with his leadership. All of these factors existed, but I think they were more important in allowing him to build this system over the past 14 years. Now, given that very centralized system, Maduro can effectively single-handedly control the allocation of resources and rewards within the political system among the followers in his party. And that means that the people who do not agree with him within the PSUV are just simply not going to have their cut in the rents of the state. That means that Maduro has, if he manages these rents in a way that's politically effective, I think that he can consolidate power over the PSUV. And then we can have an unpopular president with a powerful party. Now, can a government like that survive a period of low popularity? Well, Chavez did. Chavez had, back in 2002, he had approval ratings of 30%. How did he survive it? By not having elections while his approval rates were 30%. To the extent that the government is able not to have elections, and we don't have scheduled presidential elections up until 6 years from now, then I do think that by the time we get to those next presidential elections, the ball game might have changed so much that I think it will be another sport by then.
I want to get back to that, in particular, sort of points to push a little bit more on some of that, because I'm not sure I entirely disagree. But before we do, I want to talk about the elections first. But before that, even you mentioned that the leakages, the international, the 100,000 barrels plus that goes to Cuba, for example. How much does the government save by cutting those off? I mean, people are sort of trying to predict at what point the government will, cut its lifeline to Cuba and so on. But does that represent that much revenue?
Yeah, well, we have had a discussion about this, and maybe Francisco also can give his take. I mean, if you look at sort of the numbers in terms of barrels, and it is between $5 and $6.5 billion per year. All the subsidy, and almost half of it is to Cuba. It's not clear, this is not transparent at all, so it's hard to sort of be sure how much of that you get back in terms of the doctors or
sports trainers. I always say that. I don't know what that means.
Or sports trainers.
Guys with whistles and sweatpants.
We're doing pretty badly, by the way, in sports.
Yeah, no, not getting your money's worth.
But we got a couple of good results.
Yeah.
However, I mean, and then we see, the beans coming from Nicaragua and whatever.
Yeah.
But in general, that it seems to be a significant amount of money. But as Francisco has told me, there is a significant accumulation of accounts receivable. I mean, for the Venezuelan government with the rest of the world that are considerably larger than the amount that are just mentioning. So there seems to be some room there. I wonder. I mean, some of the sort of smaller countries, I think they can cut, and they, in fact, we have heard rumors of already Rafael Ramirez telling them you have to pay. I mean, even since last year. But of course, President Chavez had this gave all this importance to his international influence, etc. I wonder if Maduro will have that sort of interest. And moreover, given the fact that he doesn't face, at least if he wins the election and it's accepted, he doesn't face sort of the situation that Chavez in some periods faced of a sort of an international backlash against him. So I think he might have some room to cut a little bit of the subsidies. And of course, I mean, if you go to the Dominican Republic and you say, I mean, we're not going to subsidize you that much, we'll subsidize you only a little bit. I mean, it's hard for them to say we are really mad at you because you are still giving me a little bit of some, So I think there will be room there, even maybe with the Cubans, but probably, I mean, probably they will not do it. I mean, a sudden stop of the subsidy, because that would mean a big problem for the Cubans. Yeah.
Go to the elections. We were talking before we started. And I know you had a panel recently with Luis Vicente Leon. Give me a sense of sort of, I don't want to spend too much time on the elections because, as I say, we can game this out. But what's your sense of the way the election's going? In particular, both of you have implied is that a lot of the coverage, like for example, William Newman's piece today in the New York Times, talked about sort of this mysticism and this spiritual connection that Chavez has. What you're implying is actually it's much more rational than that. There may be some elements of spiritual connection, but people's pocketbooks really do matter in this. So give us a sense of what's going in terms of public opinion polling, in terms of actually also the extent to which the state is, priming the patronage pumps to help ensure his election, Maduro's election.
If you try to compare this election with the elections in October, there are a lot of similarities, but there are some basic differences. One of them is that Venezuela is going through a macro adjustment. It's going through an economic crisis, and that has an effect on people's voting behavior. And in fact, one of the reasons why Chavez was able to win and to win by such a comfortable margin was that the economy was growing at 5.6%. Our estimates have the economy actually shrinking this quarter in Venezuela, and that means that people's real incomes are going down, and that makes them less willing to vote for the government. The other fact that you have is that Maduro is obviously not Chavez. Maduro doesn't have Chavez's charisma. He doesn't have Chavez's appeal, which had been constructed over a very lengthy history. On the other hand, so these factors work against Maduro, but on the other hand, you have the fact that Chavez is much more popular dead than alive. Chavez's popularity went up from 57% to 75% after he died. And it's interesting because that popularity is measured as the approval rating, and it's the answer to the question, do you think that the president is doing a good job for the country? Now it's, do you think that Chavez did a good job for the country? 75% of Venezuelans think that Chavez did a good job for the country. It's not a very good scenario for a person who was trying to tell them a few months ago that Chavez was doing a bad job to now compete for president. So that's a handicap that Capriles is going to have. And the other handicap is that the opposition lost 5 governorships, 5 of 8 governorships that it held in the last regional elections, including 2 of the 3 states with the highest population, the largest one, which is Zulia, and the 3rd largest one, which is Carabobo. In Venezuela, and particularly for both the government and the opposition, the access to public government implies a very large capacity of mobilization, of being able to use these resources for your party machinery. And what that means is that the opposition is no longer going to have that formidable machinery that they had in Zulia, that they had in Carabobo, that they had in Nueva Esparta. And that should mean that even if opinion polls were telling you exactly the same that they told you before Chavez, I would actually expect Maduro to get more votes because he has a machinery which, compared to that of the opposition, is stronger now, or the opposition's one is weaker. Now, what do the polls say? The polls right now are actually telling a very similar story to the story that they were telling 1 week before the October 2012 elections. Obviously, there's polls all over the place, although you don't have any established Venezuelan polling firm right now saying that this is a tie or saying that Capriles would win. You do have some new firms which were just published today saying that Capriles is winning, but one of them is, and these are firms that have never participated in Venezuela, so it's very hard to assess their track records. So one of the ways that we've had of looking, since there's so much variation among the polls, of looking at the data is that we at Bank of America built this historical database of all of the polling firms, and we have calculated their average prediction bias in all of the contests since 1998 in which Chavez or Chavismo had been involved, and we can then take the results and actually adjust them for the polling biases of these firms. That aggregate indicator right now is giving us an 11.8 lead for Maduro. That for me is pretty much a reasonable guess of where the election will end up, which again means if in a very similar to where the October 2012 elections were. There will likely be more abstention. I think that there will be abstention on both sides. There's going to be voters who would only vote for Chavez and are not going to vote for Maduro because Maduro is not Chavez. And then there are voters on the side of the opposition who were completely convinced and maybe are still completely convinced that Capriles won the elections in October and decided that the system is so completely rigged that it doesn't make sense to vote, and those won't turn up. I think that those effects are both going to work in roughly similar magnitudes, and therefore you shouldn't have something too different from what you had last year.
Monelli, you're a political scientist. Leaving aside the issue of whether the vote tallying will be rigged, what's your sense of the freeness and fairness of this election in terms of use of public resources, in terms of access to media, in terms of freedom from coercion? What's your...
Well, first of all, it's crazy to have an election with a 10-day campaign for the most important job in a country. So even though I guess way it's written in the Constitution can be, by the way, they didn't do it within 30 days either, so not even.
Let's be honest, I mean, Diaz de la Cabello should be president, interim president as well. So
exactly.
there's a little bit of give and take there.
But still, I mean, it's really crazy. And of course, I mean, in the last campaign, with Chavez sick and therefore not doing as many cadenas, you know, as he usually did, the sort of the distribution of time of Chavez versus Capriles was like 3 to 50. I mean, it was because the Capriles has 3 minutes of ads that he can put in, you know, in the media. The government has the same 3 minutes plus minutes that they have as a government, and then all the cadenas. And if you put all that together, it is such I mean, a huge and moreover, when Chavez was sick, Capriles was running all over the country, and Chavez did not campaign, and as a result, at least Capriles had a slight advantage in terms of the news coverage because they had to cover that he was around and the other guy was not around, right? But now, I mean, Maduro is all over the place, using all the resources. I mean, his head of mobilization is the president of PDVSA. That I mean, I think tells you all. I mean, it's really appalling how PDVSA has become simply, I mean, sort of in times of election.
Yeah, not even an instrument of the government, but an instrument of the party.
Oh, completely. And they don't even, right now, care about, you know, the appearances. It used to be that at least, you know, you had to guard a little bit about not looking as completely openly using the national oil company. So, the disadvantages for Capriles are huge. That's why I think that we have to look at the 11 or 10.6 lead that Chavez had in October as actually a small lead. I mean, if you think about the fact that this is the government that received the largest windfall in history, much larger than any other in Latin America, but most of the other incumbents in Latin America won by much larger margins, like Rafael Correa in Ecuador. And moreover, they had this, in particular, the 2012 year, you know, 50% of GDP expenditure. I mean, a dramatic increase in the real wages of the public sector and a little bit in the private sector. I mean, all these things together should have allowed Chavez to win by a much larger margin. Right now, I think, and I'm a political economist, so for me, it's very hard to understand, you know, these emotional issues. I'm really, I mean, I'm completely, surprised by the fact that you can, you know, after you die, you can increase 20 points. It's really,
well, imagine though it's his approval rating, so it's even more important. Like,
So exactly. It's not like they like you, but it's that you did a great job. Apparently, after you die, you know. So it's this is something that I'm not going to be able to explain. However, I think normal politics will set back in eventually, and then you have. You know, you have some local elections in Venezuela that are going to happen eventually this year. Depending on the timing, that might create some opportunities for the opposition. We don't know. On the other hand, we are seeing other spaces of the opposition disappearing. I mean, apparently, you know, the only TV station that it's openly in the opposition is going to move to a different position. And so we are seeing the spaces. I mean, the CNE will have to elect a new board. I mean, Tibisay Lucena and Vicente Diaz are going to end their terms, and that probably means that, I mean, we don't know, but that could mean that we have a full, completely, openly, Chavista CNE, and that will create, again, sort of incentives for the more radical in the opposition to say, I mean, this is not fair, and it will be true. I mean, and so the spaces for having a democratic strategy for the opposition will shrink. I mean, right now I think it's really I mean, the spaces that the opposition have are really small. I mean, basically a couple of governorships, because Amazonas is a tiny state, less than a municipality. So it will be really hard. And I do not expect, even though I as Francisco, I expect Maduro to maybe become more pragmatic in the economics. I do not expect him to become any more negotiating in the politics unless he faces a situation eventually that calls for some moderation in that area. But I don't see it now. Unless, by the way, I mean, I think it matters the size of the result, right? If Maduro wins by 15 or more points, he will have a great boost. You know, winning for more than Chavez, that is amazing for him. On the other hand, if he wins only by a very small margin, that will show that he's not Chavez. You know,
yeah.
That he so the size of the result, and of course, nobody. I mean, we cannot rule completely out. There might be an electoral surprise, but I mean, things are tightening a little bit. But as Francisco said, the numbers still look pretty much as they looked in October.
Here to summarize what we just said is Catherine. No, thank you for coming. I'm sorry about the traffic.
No, it's actually, I feel like it's a race to the bottom in the ugly contest between infrastructure in Caracas, the infrastructure in Newark Airport. So.
He was saying the
same thing, yeah.
Oh,
At least it's not raining.
So I'm sorry.
In Caracas, things freeze. Well, I'm going to let you get in on this, but I want to sort of press Francisco a little bit on something that I know you have an opinion on. You mentioned that given the hyper-presidentialism of Venezuela, you said that Maduro could possibly sort of use that to his advantage. The difference seems to be, first of all, is the party itself is very, very splintered. And that you will have a situation where, at least institutionally, it's very centralized. But in terms of the popularity and sort of the divisions within them, because the party is not particularly institutionalized, where you could get mass mobilizations, a popular reaction against sort of declining or deteriorating economic situations, in which others who are competing for the mantle of Chavismo may then sort of jockey and use that to their advantage to press Maduro out. Play that one out a little bit. I mean, because that's sort of the scenario everyone is sort of imagining. Is that?
I think that that scenario is definitely possible. I wouldn't completely discount it. But I'm not seeing any signs that the party is really split. I mean, I'm not seeing any signs right now that Maduro doesn't hold the power in the party. I think that if there were signs of that, we would have seen concessions to the other groups. We would have seen, for example, Cabello assume the interim presidency, which he did not. We would have seen that we would have seen a major appointment go to a Cabello loyalist or somebody from another group. In fact, the appointments that we've seen, both the foreign minister, Hawa, and Reyes, and the vice presidency are people from the Maduro/Cuba group. If you look at the appointments in Cadivi, which are the more recent appointments, which are also it's a very key institution in the control of resources, it's basically of two persons. One of them is close to Nelson Merentes. Both of them come from the central bank. One of them is close to Nelson Merentes, and one of them, Jose Can, is actually very close to Maduro himself. They both come from the labor union movement. So right now, I'm not seeing any signs that he really has had to negotiate internally. Second of all, I would still emphasize that the control over resources is extremely relevant at the moment in which you assure loyalties within the party. And I think that Chavez had built this structure of resources which was so highly centralized that it allowed him to develop these one-on-one bargains with political leaders, local political leaders. So if you were a governor, if you were a mayor, and you wanted to get a bridge built in your city, in your state, in traditional Venezuelan politics, you would have gone to the Congress. You would have spoken with the party leaders. You would have spoken with the chair of the Finance Commission. No, you didn't do that right now in Venezuela because most oil revenues were going to Fonden and the Chinese fund. So you had to speak to Giordani, or you had to speak to Chavez himself, or you spoke to the vice president. Those were the guys who got you the money. Now, to the extent that Maduro actually has that control over resources, then that means that if anybody is not going with the party line, he can say, well, there are no more resources for you guys, and you guys end up completely isolated. This, in fact, was what Chavez did during 2003. Chavez came in with a very splintered political system. Chavez came in supported by a set of parties in which the party that he had founded, which was the Movimiento Quinta República, did not have a majority in Congress. And he was 2 votes shy of losing the majority in Congress. And he actually was able to hold on to it through this direct transfer of resources to his local political leaders. Now, again, I would emphasize, it's one thing, it was Chavez's leadership and Chavez's capacity was necessary to build a system. But now the system exists. He just had to transfer it. The capacity, the threshold for being able to administer that system is somewhat different from that of being able to build it. And the question that we're going to have to face right now is, well, does Maduro have the capacity to administer this system in his benefit? I wouldn't say I'm certain that's going to happen, but I wouldn't rule it out. What happens if he's able to do it? I think we end up with a unified PSUV party under his control. And then I think that we can end up with a political system which could be a challenge political system. It could be, in what possibly for me would be the best case scenario, you actually get a two-party political system developing here. So you actually have the opposition doing reasonably well in these elections, and therefore the government not being able to move in for that political kill. And then you basically have two parties in which two-party systems do have this feature of stability built in. It doesn't always work, but it actually does a lot. When you have competitive two-party elections, then politicians tend to go to the middle. They tend to fight over swing voters, and that by itself brings some moderation. But on the other hand, if you have a scenario in which Maduro wins by a very large margin, and also in which he's able to consolidate power over the PSUV, then I think that we could very well be facing a possibility of a leftist one-party state developing in Venezuela. And the PRI was a one-party state for several decades, and I mean, they went through the debt crisis of the 1980s. That didn't lead them to lose power. So it's not impossible to survive as a one-party state, even through moments of very low popularity.
No, the PRI was a very corporatist, pyramidal structure as opposed to sort of the inchoateness of Chavismo. So it's a little different in the sense of the level of institutionalization. There'd have to be a lot of development of the PSUV in terms of structures of whether it's business organizations and the like to be able to build that sort of
and I think that
sustained.
And I think that you actually have more of that in Venezuela than what might appear evident at first sight. And I actually think that if you look at the type of coalitions that people like Diosdado Cabello have built up, and this is why I do think that he is going to end up playing an important role, even within an agreement with Maduro, these are actually coalitions in which local political leaders have links with local businessmen and with factors from the military. I think that you do have, you don't have, and also, it's, I mean, the PRI wasn't the same all along. The PRI evolved into the type of structure that you're describing. But I do think that you have the emergence of what might be a different type of corporativism, but one which would still allow for a party structure that is able to generate and reproduce its own power.
Before I turn to Francisco, do you have any, as a political scientist, do you have any comments on it?
I mean, I think that the dependence on oil in Venezuela is so much higher than in Mexico that I mean, the volatility that we will face in the next few years is so high that it will be really hard to sort of sustain power in the same sort of way that the Mexicans did. But on the other hand, I mean, the control of sort of all the major, I mean, all media, I mean, resources. I mean, the control that the president of Venezuela has today of resources, I think there is not even the Mexican president. But I mean, the Mexican president, precisely because he had a very institutionalized system, did not have control of resources as the Venezuelan president has today. I mean, they control, I mean, discretionarily almost 70% of the oil revenues through either PDVSA or the funds that the president controls. So they do have a lot of sort of tools to control power. But if either the price of oil goes down, as sometimes happens, I mean, we cannot predict it. Not recently, but it did. I mean, by the way, if we had a collapse of the price that nobody's expecting, similar to the one we had in 2009, I mean, compared to that period, and the time they had a lot of money saved, but now their external position is much worse. So any sort of event that might create trouble in that area could end up in. I mean, and as Francisco pointed out, they survive a 30%. I mean, a popularity level of 30% in the past, but with a coup and an oil strike it's not going to happen again, of course. But that shows that, I mean, that the sort of the level of upheaval that it created in Venezuelan society, and previous adjustments in Venezuela that were, of course, higher. The one in 1996 in the surface didn't cause that much trouble, but it ended up leading to the election of President Chavez, and of course the '89 had all the effects that we know about.
Kind of bring in on this, one of the things we asked was what difficulties or what economic adjustments, policies, dilemmas will the new government face? So give us a sense of what effect will that have on the government. Give us your sense from Boltec, what your sense is.
So this is our view on Venezuela at this point. Of course, everyone knows the combination of unsustainable policies that we're in right now. High inflation and accelerating after a couple devaluations and convoluted policies. Massive shortage of US dollars, massive food shortages, violent crime, et cetera. So those are the issues that I think, of course, anyone that wins faces. But there's one thing that I will add, that I think that Chavez was so unique. I think he was so unique that even if Maduro tries to be him, I think there's two avenues that they can take. Even if he tries to be him, he will be a failure, a huge failure. And I think that with Maduro's failure, I think therein Chavismo is very severely weakened, absolutely debilitated, because it comes to light how complex this mix has been. I mean, just consider import growth. So you have 25% year-over-year import growth. I mean, the disparity between import demand exacerbated by an overvalued currency with woeful incapacity to pay for those imports just shows you that there's a huge balance of payments issue that's really in the near term in Venezuela. I mean, you have current account surplus, but you have PDVSA declining in production. You don't have enough dollars in the system. So there's some huge black clouds on the horizon. I think that from the perspective of the opposition, just to kind of mix both the politics and the economics of this in, from the perspective of the opposition, in my view, the best thing that can happen to them is if they don't win. Because if they don't win, they can look to the next election to win it. This one, they're not going to win. What I think they're doing is positioning, keeping some space to be able to win in the future, whether it be 3 years or 6 years. Because as we know in the 6-year term, at midpoint, at 3 years, the Venezuelans can vote in a referendum to get rid of the president or not. If there is this economic crisis that I think is culminating on the horizon without some pragmatic solution or exercising of that solution over the next few years, there will be a crisis. There will be a crisis. So I think that at that point, I think at this point, Chavismo is massively debilitated. Whether it's in 3 years or 6 years or further, I think that there will be an alternative to Chavismo. My question is, what type of president will Maduro be to get there? In 3 years' time, I tend to disagree. Right now, Diosdado Cabello is totally in line. Everyone's in line, PSUV. It's impossible not to be. Chavez chose Nicolás Maduro, and that's the guy who's going to win. Diosdado Cabello knows it's a losing fight to try to challenge that, because he would be viewed as probably a betrayer among many things against Chavez. So he would be hated, in my view. He's already not liked, but he would be hated. So I think he's biding his time. I think he's ready to jump into the grave of Nicolás Maduro when and if Maduro is a failure. So whether it's in 3 years, Maduro, I think he's just spring-loaded and biding his time. That's my view.
What happens to everyone, and then we'll open it up for questions, what happens to Capriles if he loses? He's lost 2 elections. Is he seen as sort of the perennial loser and the opposition fragments again? Or is he seen as sort of having done his duty and people swing behind him? Let's start with you, Francisco.
That's on the margin. I think that if he loses by more than 10, 11 points, I don't think that he can get to be candidate again. I think that if he maintains the gap in single digits, then he's the natural leader of the opposition, and he'll probably, he'll be the natural leader of the opposition. I'm not sure that I actually see as clear as a roadmap for there being presidential elections, because you don't just hold a recall referendum in Venezuela. You have to collect the signatures of 20% of registered voters, and the last time that was done, the list of signers was published on the internet, and all of them lost their jobs. And a lot of those people are not going to sign again. So yes, I mean, we can have this developing in many different ways, but I do think that if he can keep it in the single digits, then he'll continue to be the leader of the opposition.
I agree that if he keeps us in the single leader, he will be the leader of the opposition. He controls, of course, I mean, he's the only governor of a large state. Yeah. And he, I mean, I think he has done remarkably good campaigns both times, very different campaigns. I mean, the previous one was a hard campaign against, you know, Hugo Chavez and the guy being sick with all this money around, but he was able, I think, to reach the middle, the ninis, or the people that are sort of Chavistas light, if you want to call them. I mean, Chavez, the day of the election, had a popularity in most of the polls that that showed that he was going to win by about 10 points, had a much higher popularity of, say, 60 to 63%. So you can argue that to some extent Capriles got about 5 to 8% of people that were Chavistas to vote actually for him. And in this election, I mean, he faces a very different strategy because he's trying to show Maduro, not Chavez. I mean, he's turning negative because, of course, he wants to frame Maduro as a guy that we know that until very recently had a popularity below 45% or 40 or even 40 to be the candidate and not Chavez. And so if he pulls it off, I mean, with a small win, he will be. The other, of course, the other potential leader for the opposition is Henry Falcón, the governor of the state of Lara, a former Chavista, who has done a very interesting job in terms of, you know, he has this idea of inclusion without exclusion, you know, sort of being the good parts of the Chavismo without the bad parts, sort of. And so I think
you would call it a compassionate conservative.
I think Falcón is a formidable politician. He's completely now in line with Capriles, but he will have a future. I mean, I think maybe the Chavistas try to go to take him down. I mean, to try to find some type of legal procedure against him, because they believe, I mean, till now he's, I mean, not well known in the country. I mean, he has a low level of people knowing him. But that will be the other. But I wouldn't bet against even against Henrique Capriles. I mean, this is a very persistent guy, and we have. And we have seen that in politics, you know, sometimes in the case of Chavez, not even death.
No, he's still going strong. He's a bird. What happens to the opposition? I think to Capriles and to the opposition generally. They're unfortunately named mud. Mesa.
Right. Henrique Capriles is such a natural leader and natural unifier, so of course, ideally, he would be the one. But I agree with both Franciscos that a single digit, he remains the leader. And I mean, historically, you have seen that be the case, where a politician can lose in Venezuela repeatedly and come out ultimately the victor. But yeah, I mean, there's so many iterations this can take over the next few years. But I do think my bottom line is that Chavismo is massively weakened, and even if it's splintered in 3 years' time, we're talking a different space than we were in the Lista Tacón. So I think it's, at some point there will be a change, whether it be Capriles, whether it be someone else. But I do think, I mean, look at the case of Colombia, right? I mean, I'm not super bullish. I'm more of a long-term bull on Venezuela, because things can change. I mean, look at Colombia, pre-Uribe and after Uribe. Pre-Uribe, everyone called it the failed state. After Uribe, it's one of the stars of Latin America. I mean, I can tell you from my institutional client base that that's the #1 spot that guys who want to get more exposure in Latin America are looking to. So a story can change.
Yeah. Let's take questions. I'm sure there'll be lots. So we'll start right here. Microphone's coming up behind you, so identify yourself and speak into the microphone.
We're exploring here the possibility.
Who are you?
My name is Isaac Aquinin. I'm from Florida. I live in Venezuela.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm from Venezuela and live in Florida.
Okay. I was going to say, I had to question your judgment there.
So we're here exploring possibilities and scenarios. And one thing that I don't agree is when people mention levels of popularity on Maduro's case. I don't think he has any popularity at all. He has inherited a blessing that came from God. So he's not God, he's not a saint, he's only blessed for the time being. Now, when we analyze the what-if scenario, we have two scenarios. We win or we lose. So that's very simple. And if we lose, we're going to be very sad. And that's it. If they lose, they're going to be very aggressive. And my feeling, my inquietud, what really disturbs me, and this is a question that I'm bringing here, and I'm totally in favor of Capriles and in favor of a new government, but very deep inside myself, I believe that our best option is that they win. Because as I see it, if we win, we're going to see a new development of urban terrorism guerrillas. They are going to prove that we're not able. They have 4 million employees totally, unconditionally with them. They are going to jeopardize the economy in a way that we cannot even imagine. They are going to make the public services even worse, where nobody believed that it could get any worse. They're going to prove it can get a lot worse. And they're going to make life impossible as we imagine it couldn't be.
Okay, let's take that as a question right there. I assume when you say we, you're speaking as a Venezuelan and not as a Floridian.
Well, my last thing, just to finish the statement, because I didn't bring it
Although
up.
they're becoming more
so
and more
he's
similar.
a legend right now. And if he wins in 1 or 2 years, the legend will be completely destroyed, and we will have a blank paper to start a new country, whereas otherwise, I don't see any possibility. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with Catherine. What would happen, assuming the opposition wins, or whatever eventually wins? Is there people worry about polarization? They worry about violence? Is there? I mean, maybe not even if the opposition wins this time, but in the future, how polarized?
Well, certainly the deck is stacked against the opposition, right? I mean, Chavismo owns everything. So I agree, even if Capriles did win, it would be very difficult to change kind of the direction of the boat around, given the deck so stacked against him, with Chavismo so ingrained after 14 years of unparalleled power. So I do think it will be difficult for the opposition at this point, and that's why I said what I did, because I think they have a better chance in a few years' time, whether it be 6 or beyond, 3, 6, beyond, when the Chavez factor has faded, when he's no longer in everyone's mind all the time, because he was loved. Maduro is not loved. I mean, anecdotally, with the guys that I talked to in Venezuela, they say, Chavistas love Chavez. They don't love Maduro. They'll vote for him. Some of them may not. They'll vote for him, but they don't love him. So I think as the Chavez factor fades and the impact of Chavismo, which is obviously failed economic policy, comes to the fore, and there's no Chavez to kind of smooth it out, blame it on the Yankees or blame it on whoever, and really be that charismatic figure that was so impressive, really impressive in his ability to both deflect the blame and maintain this divided coalition so united. That's not Maduro. That's not him. So I think that's really the current situation.
Okay, Monaldi, talk about two different things here. One is sort of the mobilizational capacity and the tendency to invoke violence on the Chavistas, and the second is sort of the legacy, spiritual as well as physical or institutional, of Chavismo. Give you a sense of both of those.
Yeah, well, I mean, if Capriles wins, even though the economic situation is very hard, he has some advantages over Maduro in the following sense. First, I mean, the devaluation already happened. I mean, not all, but significant part of it. He can blame it on the previous guys, and so that gives some room. He doesn't, have to come in and do a devaluation, right? I mean, he also has the advantage of probably getting, I mean, Venezuela, it now gets, in order to get a loan, has twice the risk of Nigeria, no? So if we get to the level of Nigeria, we will be, in a much better position. And so
you don't hear that very often.
he can do, so that shows you where we are.
Yeah.
So that gives him some room to maneuver compared to Maduro in the sense of creating, positive expectations. Of course, I mean, so I think he might have more room to maneuver than we would imagine. On the other hand, I do think that the Chavismo will have a significant capacity to create trouble. I mean, not only, controlling, the Supreme Court and Congress and most governorships and but all these sort of paramilitary groups and all these. So this could create some potential chaos in society, and so it will be a really tough situation. I wonder, though, about this. Of course, everybody says, for example, that if Perón would have taken all the cost of, that the military throw him out, and then all the effects of Perón's policies happen under them. And so if he had received sort of all the cost of the mess he had created, he would not have become, the figure that he was, and Peronismo will not be what it is today. Some people point out that President Jaime Lucinchi left government with the highest popularity rating, and a year after that, because of the adjustment that had to happen, lost all of that. I think that the legacy of Chavez is, for a long time, will be of Chavez. I don't know about Chavismo, but of Chavez will be as a figure that was great to the poor, and he died just at the right time for that. So he was lucky even in the timing of his death. But I think that even though it might look like one of these, I completely agree that if the Chavismo, if Maduro gets all the cost of the adjustment, it might be eventually good for the opposition, and it might create a learning in the Venezuelan society about how these unsustainable policies had to, had to
pay the price.
Had to pay the price. However, of course, in the middle, we might see a very messy situation without the institutional. So, you have a 6-year term, even though you have this recall referendum, as Francisco pointed out, it's hard to implement it, and then you have unlimited re-election that creates sort of the PRI didn't have. They had 6 years, but you had to get out. So this is the kind of institutional setting. All the concentration of power that, on the one hand, serves as a tool, also creates all these incentives for other players like the military or the Cabello or others to say, if we allow this guy Maduro to control everything, we will be completely obliterated from power. So the fact that they concentrate so much power also creates sort of potential problems for building this coalition.
Game.
Exactly.
I'll let you respond, Rodriguez, after, but we have more questions here. So let's go all the way in the back there. Your hand shot up.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Juan Lechín. I'm from Bolivia. I'm a political analyst. I have a question. I have been listening to you, and obviously very bright people, very well informed. Thank you very much for the lecture. But generally, although you show the different takings of power that Chavismo has in the army forces, in the parliament, in everything, in the TSJ, in the justice, etc., you always put the weight of the analysis on an island where, like the elections, where if the elections were an island apart from that stronghold that the Chavismo has, and they don't let anybody in, but you put always the analysis in the one digit, the possibilities, as if that island of elections were a fair play. Wouldn't you consider that the weight of the analysis is on the side of power in the Cuban intervention, in how to get rid of a very tremendous power that chokes not only Venezuela, but all Latin America? I'm Bolivian, I've been in Peru, I know the case of Venezuela, I know the case of Nicaragua, we all know the case of Argentina, and so on and so forth. So wouldn't we have to put the weight of our intelligence and our analysis? Yes, of course, we have to intervene in elections. Great. But the deep analysis we have to do how to overthrow by elections, by civil disobedience, I don't know, but put our intelligence on the side that they have taken already. And of course, considering that there is no fraud, and the inform or the report Febres Cordero Marquez already says that there is fraud. Aguana in his blog says and demonstrates that there is fraud. So I've heard that in sometimes, probably I have the feeling that you have considered that part of the elections in Venezuela as being a fair play.
Let me take a whole bunch of, I don't want to cut that question short because I think it's important, sort of elections as being one sort of sporadic point, but we have a lot of questions up. So let me move to my right. We'll go all the way in the back and work ourselves. And we also are on webcast. I don't know if any of our web watchers have any questions. I don't even know how to get them to us, but.
Hi, how are you? My name is Daniel Simkin. I'm Venezuelan. I live here in New York. I would like to know what's going to happen even though Capriles or Maduro wins. What's going to happen with the private sector? What's going to happen with Cadivi? What's going to happen with those dollars that they're approving? They're going to still approve those dollars? They're going to still employ more people inside of the country? Because it's true that 50%, 40%, I'm not sure about the numbers, are public employees, but the other half of the part are private employees. What's going to happen if they don't have the dollars to import or to ensemble inside of the country and to employ more people inside of the country? What's going to happen to that, even though Capriles or Maduro wins? Thank you.
Great. If you can pass the microphone like right there, right in front of you. There you go. And then
short question.
I want to ask a
okay. Just
thank
don't
you.
fight over it. Just get
Sorry,
someone
I
please
have
to.
a question that.
Your name, please?
Mariana Martin. I'm
Okay.
Venezuelan. And evidently, after the elections, whoever has to face the economic crisis is going to have to do some reforms and some changes. And my question is, since Maduro has shown that he is sort of willing or pressured to do these reforms, and we don't really know his political personality in a way, he's showing Chavez and not himself, do you think he's going to be willing to do some changes to reduce the risk of investing in Venezuela to promote foreign investment? And my other question is, the day of the inauguration, what's going to happen? What's going to happen with that in case Capriles wins?
You're getting your gown ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, right next to you, to your left.
Sorry.
Eduardo Maciu. I have not heard a question about the future regarding drugs and cartels. Is Venezuela a possible narcoestado like what happened with Colombia?
Great. Carolina,
Hi.
how are you?
I work here at the council, and I'm also Venezuelan.
But you still have a name. It's Carolina.
Carolina, yeah, sorry. I'm just wondering a little bit about who's making the decisions. And, you know, we're talking about Maduro as this incompetent person, former bus driver, and no one, I wonder who's behind, you know, the decision making when it comes to the partido or to what Maduro's doing right now. It was a little unclear with Chavez, but he was such a big personality. It always seemed like he was making the final decision. I wonder if it's the same for Maduro.
Good. Any more questions on this side? Okay, right there, to your right.
Hello, I'm Jonathan.
I'm everyone, just let's pass it around. We'll all ask questions.
American.
It's like testimonials. Go
it
ahead.
was discussed that the current account balances aren't in Venezuela's favor, that they've depleted reserves, and their inflation is in terrible condition. They're facing a 40% devaluation, and I'd like to know what steps they can possibly take to avoid default and to maintain funding funding for the government.
And what was your name again?
Jonathan Gartenberg.
Okay, let's go over here now. Assuming the microphone can make it over there. Okay, who a couple of people? There we go.
Hi, Pete Majeski. I recently lost my job, so if anyone's hiring, I'm your man.
Okay.
Anyways,
okay.
Easy question. Based on the outcome of the election, how will relations with three main countries change, if any? Cuba, United States, and Colombia. Thank you.
Okay. Right there.
Hey, I'm also Venezuelan, David. I work at Credit Suisse in energy. I think today a big article came out that Venezuela stopped their investments through PDVSA in Bolivia after having invested over $108 million. You know, I think they stopped investing when Chavez died that day. They froze all the investments in Bolivia. Was this a strategy to divert the funds for political campaigns? Is this because there is some friction with Bolivia these days? What's happening in the current situation with our previous investments out there?
Any other questions? Okay, so we have questions. I'll just quickly go through them to be fair. Juan, power versus elections. Danielle, private sector. What are they going to do? Mariela, the Maduro. What will he do to reduce risk for investors? Eduardo, drugs and cartels. Carolina, who's behind Maduro? Who's advising him? John, what's the status? Jonathan, status of current accounts. Pete, does anyone have a job for me? And what's the status of Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, and the U.S.? And last, David, Bolivia investments of PDVSA. Although I can say on that thing, I had heard actually already that had been, that Evo had said he didn't want the investments on PDVSA, but I'll let others. We'll start with you.
All of them. Wow. Okay, so let's start with the issue of fraud. I think that there have been a lot of discussions, statistical discussions about whether there's fraud in Venezuela or not, or there was, and there are also a lot of different electoral processes, so that even if you establish that there was something that didn't go as it should have in the 2004 recall referendum, that doesn't necessarily mean that the system right now is vulnerable to fraud. You know, what I think, my view of this right now is the following. I think that, first of all, the unfairness of the system comes overwhelmingly from the control of the state over resources, over access to the media, from the way in which the state restricts others from politically participating, even in the use of bias, corruption allegations for people, against people in the opposition, for doing things which are kind of laughable in comparison to what PSUV politicians do every single day. I think that that's where the big imbalance of in resources is. Now, given that, I do still think that we have a reality in Venezuela which, if you ignore it, you do it at your own risk. Chavez had a tremendous effect and impact on the thinking of Venezuelans and on the way in which poor Venezuelans view society. And poor Venezuelans have felt empowered under Chavez. That is a reality, whether you like it or not. And that's something that's going to have an impact on Venezuela in these elections, next year, 3 years from now, and I think 5, 10 years from now. And I must say, you know, I've been hearing that we're 2 years from the end of Chavismo for the past 14 years. And at some moment I said, you know, this must be wrong. And then 2 years ago it became, no, of course it's right, because Chavez is going to die and there's no Chavismo without Chavez. And it's impossible for anybody to win these elections except for Chavez. And that's going to be disproven. And I think that if we try to ask ourselves, why is it that this interpretation has been so problematic, it has to do with the fact that in Venezuela, as well as over essentially all of Latin America, there is a space for leftist movements, and there is a space for radical leftist movements. And these radical leftist movements are essentially capturing the aspirations that people over the region and the different countries have for addressing issues of social justice which they feel have not been addressed. Now, what's the tragedy of Venezuela? The Venezuelans are convinced, and the poor Venezuelans that have supported Chavez are convinced, that Chavez came in and solved the distributive problem. But Chavez didn't solve a distributive problem. He just had a lot more resources to spend. The price of Venezuelan oil reached its lowest level since this has been recorded, since 1920, since we have that on it, in the second week of December of 1998. A barrel of Venezuelan oil was selling for $7.6 a barrel. That was the week in which Chavez won the presidential elections in 1998. So what Chavez has had is this huge availability of resources, and he spent it on just about everything.
So what you're saying is the Pope may be Argentine, but God is Chavista.
Well, and now that Chavez is no longer with us, Venezuelans are praying to Chavez. And there are altars. And yesterday, in this act of, in Maduro's campaign event, basically, there was this woman who came up to him, going with the joke with the birds, and he actually gave him 2 birds. And these birds, and Maduro put them to fly, and these birds were kind of essentially embodiments of the spirit of Chavez. But this woman started telling the story of how every single night she prayed to Chavez. And she prayed to Chavez that Maduro would win. So I think that Chavez is going, Chavez is here. Chavez is going to be in Venezuelan politics for the next 10, 20 years. That's a completely different question of whether the PSUV disappears. And PSUV might disappear. Maduro might be a failure. But if Maduro is a failure, don't count on the opposition necessarily coming into power. Because there are going to be a lot of Chavistas who will say, why did Maduro fail? Because Maduro devalued. Chavez wouldn't have devalued. Because Maduro started firing public employees. Because Maduro wasn't tough on the oligarchy. Now we need a real Chavista. So this is very explosive politics. And I think that, for me, the lesson and the bottom line of that, and the reason why I'm actually not so high on Capriles as being kind of the political leader, I'm not so sure that a country that's been kind of so segmented, so polarized, where the Venezuelan poor feel that they've been betrayed and they've been continuously betrayed by the elites, that this isn't going to necessarily be solved by somebody that the Venezuelan poor don't feel is one of them. And I, frankly, for all that I respect and appreciate Henrique Capriles, I'm not sure that he's gotten to that level of connection with the Venezuelan people. Let me try to address some of there are a lot of questions. Okay, who's advising Maduro? I think that Maduro doesn't know because Maduro didn't really train himself to be president. Maduro is foreign minister. He knows very little about domestic policy. He's relying on the same advisors that Chavez had. I think that he's disenchanted with some of them, like Giordani, and that means that the balance of power within the economic cabinet moves. But he really has very few people, and he hasn't had space to build a team. I think that after the elections, if he does get elected and he does have more space, then I think that we're going to start seeing the real Maduro, and we're going to see that in the type of appointments that he makes. And I think that there we're going to have a clear answer as to what's going to happen to the private sector. There are going to be less dollars in Venezuela right now. Whether this is Maduro, whether it's Capriles, whether it's Maria Bolivar. There are less dollars because the country ran out of dollars. And that means that there are going to be less dollars to the private sector. And somebody, whoever is president, is going to at some moment tell the private sector, yes, it's true that you need to get the same dollars that you had last year in order to be able to produce what you produced last year. But there aren't any dollars, so you're not going to produce what you produced last year, and the country is going to go into a recession. And then, after the adjustment, then maybe there will be conditions for the country to grow again.
Reducing risk for the private sector, think you'll do it?
I think that Maduro, we don't know, but I would not rule out the possibility that Maduro is actually a lot more moderate than what we're seeing now. I wouldn't rule it out, I wouldn't count on it. I don't think that what we've seen right up to now is really an important indication, an informative indication of what direction he's going to move in. Because if Maduro is a moderate, when's he going to reveal it? Like the day after Chavez dies? You think he was going to change the whole cabinet right after Chavez died? Or the day after the election? No. Maduro has to, if he were a moderate, which we don't know if he is, he's going to have to move very slowly. So I think we're going to see these changes come in gradually. But I do think that there are strong forces that will make him be more pragmatic. What's happening to the production of oil, the fact that they have to find a way to increase it, and one way is bringing in foreign participation. And if the fiscal crisis, the big cost of these international subsidies to other countries, which means that to the extent that you do go around cutting some of them, then maybe it's not so much of a good idea telling your UN ambassador to go and support the Syrians and support Gaddafi and support whichever crazy guy comes along. So I do think that, which goes back to this idea of the radicalism is costly, and radicalism therefore can emerge in a petrostate when you have a lot of resources. But when those resources are more limited, then the cost of being radical can be too much to bear. And I think that can be a powerful moderating tendency in the next administration.
Okay. I want you to talk about drugs and cartels as well.
Well, I don't know anything about drugs and cartels. I mean, so
whatever you feel qualified about.
I mean, I wanted to follow on the point that, I mean, it's important to understand that most of the policy preferences of President Chavez in terms of, I mean, saying that Cuba was a model for Venezuela in terms of expropriations, in terms of the relationship with the opposition, with the church, with the autonomous universities, in terms of in general, the relationship with the private economy, etc., were not liked by a majority of Venezuelans. So as Francisco points out, I mean, this was a guy that was able not to be in the medium, close to the medium border at all in most of his preferences. I mean, 90% of Venezuelans do not believe that Cuba is a model for Venezuela, but the guy spent countless hours telling us that that was, you know, the dream country. So, so it's almost, I mean, he could only do it because he has the capital of oil to be such a radical. So if Maduro, for some reason, I mean, does not have that capital, he either will have to move or there will be not, I mean, he will not win elections. I mean, it will be a problem. Of course, he might face some of the radicals on his side. I mean, if he tries to moderate, accusing him and if he's unpopular, and he will face, he will be caught in the middle, and he will be in deep trouble. But that will be sort of, I mean, the other. I mean, I always caution us against assuming that the price of oil will be either the same or lower, as many people believe. Because, I mean, in 2009, most of if you met the opposition in Venezuela in 2009, 2010, they believed that this was going to be, you know, every year we were going up and up because you know, they saw, you know, a big recession, everything was going badly, and Chavez was losing popularity, and they thought this is, you know, a permanent tendency. And then suddenly completely changed, and it completely caught many in the opposition off guard, as it did in 2004 before the recall referendum. I mean, you had this upsurge in Chavez's popularity in 2011. I mean, Chavez was losing in elections against a general opposition candidate at some point in time in 2011, in early 2011, and then things completely changed. So I wouldn't rule out that Maduro might have some win in his favor. I mean, if he inherited a little bit of the luck of his political father, he might have. So things might change. So on the other hand, it could be the opposite. It could be a situation, a really tough situation, in which Maduro actually does not have any room to maneuver and faces a sort of a regime collapse. And then we will see what the role of, for example, the military will play. I mean, that form a particular strong portion of his coalition, and most of them are extremely pragmatic compared to the Maduro side of I mean, if you see most of the military guys, I mean, like Arias Cárdenas, like Bielma Mora, I mean, like even Diosdado have shown that they are not ideologues, that they don't like Cuba, and that they generally would be authoritarian. They will be more like a Putin-esque type of, you know, of regime. So,
final comments, Kath?
Yeah, I think Maduro will tend to be more pragmatic. I agree. I think for self-preservation he will do so. I mean, Chavismo doesn't want to see an economic collapse. They don't want to see a crisis. So I think the willingness and capacity to default is there, to not to default is there to pay. So I don't think there will be a default. One of the issues you asked me initially about the economic crisis that's looming is the spending and revenue disequilibrium. So yeah, I agree. He's going to have to increase revenues because he's not going to cut spending. That's my view. He's going to have to increase. So that's going to come from, hopefully, logically, the oil sector. That takes time. But I think you could see some increased pragmatism towards the oil-producing sector. Another thing is, I mean, in less than 2 months' time, he devalued twice. I mean, SICAD is a devaluation. Yeah. So I think I look at that and I say that, well, that's some indication, potentially, of a more moderate stance over his presidency. I mean, of course, in the near term, he's going to sound as Chavez-like as possible. So he increased the rhetoric and very heated. But I do think he will have to be more pragmatic. And default, as I mentioned, unless oil prices absolutely collapse down to 50 or something like that, I don't see the looming threat of default. There's really, it's very, very low.
I'll say this, I'll close on this. I remember there was a joke in Washington a few years after Chavez was elected, given this sort of this drumbeat of always he's going to collapse, he's going to fail, that George W. Bush sort of had fell into a coma and woke up 20 years later, and he wakes up, he says, whatever happened to that Ahmadinejad? Oh, he left a long time ago, he was pushed out by the mullahs. Whatever happened to Putin? Like, oh, Putin was pushed out, he goes, whatever happened to Castro? Like, oh, Castro died. And whatever happened to Chavez? He's like, he's still there, but I actually hear he's not going to last for another 2 years. I mean, this idea, like the capacity of people to overplay and expect and misunderstand, or as George Bush would say, misunderestimate, the popularity of Chavez, it was very profound. One question that I think we didn't really get to, which was actually the first question, which is an important one, which is sort of, you know, at what point a democratic regime stops being democratic and we pin our hopes on elections? And I think that's a difficult one. And I think I'm going to venture an answer here, which is keys off what Francisco said, which is as much as, you know, the risk is, as much as the system may be gamed towards the government and the state may be politicized, as long as that government has some popularity, if you abandon elections, I think you abandon sort of you know, you risk marginalizing and ostracizing an entire segment of the population. And so as gamed as the system may be, it's very difficult to abandon the electoral process as a way of changing the power. And I realize it's problematic, but it's what it is. So listen, please join me in thanking our panelists and have a chance to